Good morning, guys. Hello. All right, let's talk about our news stories for this week. You know that we always get news stories and we work on different skills with each story. Well, this story is actually not stories. They're going to be poems. And we worked on poems and poetry a little while ago. So let's go back over and see if we can remember what a poem is so we know what we're going to be reading this week, okay? All right, so let's remember poems have rhyming words. Usually that's something that people always remember about poems, that usually they rhyme. Oh, they have a rhythm, kind of like a song. They have something that kind of goes with it, like a beat or a rhythm. Oh, a lot of times they'll use interesting word choices, kind of those big fancy words instead of using boring words. They like to use those interesting words. And they are also written in lines, not paragraphs. Let's take a look at a poem and we'll see if we can find the lines and the rhyming words and some interesting words, and we'll talk about the rhythm of the poem, okay? So here is one that we'll look at. All right, this poem is called Frost, and it's written by Valerie Bloom. And she's actually going to read the poem to us. So let's listen to Valerie read her poem, Frost. And remember, we're looking for how it's written in lines, and rhyming words, and interesting word choices, and the rhythm.
Frost. Overnight, a giant spilled icing sugar on the ground. He spilled it on the hedgerows and the trees without a sound. He made a wedding cake of the haystack in the field. He dredged the countryside, and the grass was all concealed. He sprinkled sugar on the roofs, in patches not too neat. And in the morning when we woke, the world around was sweet.
I liked that poem. I also liked her voice. She had a very nice voice to read that poem, or I thought she did. So when we look at Frost, we can see that it's written in lines. There's really not any like periods or end marks. She just uses a lot of commas, and the period's at the very end. And that's what I mean by wrote in lines. It's not really paragraphs or sentences, just written in lines. And if you'll notice, at the end of the lines are usually the rhyming words: ground and sound, field and concealed, neat and sweet. You can tell that those are words that sound the same. They rhyme. She also used some interesting words, like I noticed these words I didn't know here: dredged and concealed. He dredged the countryside and the grass was all concealed. Well, I know concealed means like hidden, so I'm guessing dredged might mean like covered. He covered the countryside and the grass was all hidden. That would make sense. So yeah, she used those instead of saying covered and hidden. She liked to use these more interesting words that mean the same thing. And you could tell it kind of had a rhythm. He spilled it in the hedgerows and the trees without a sound. He made a wedding cake of the haystack in the field. He dredged the countryside and the grass was all concealed. It's sort of like a song, isn't it? And that's what it means by rhythm. All right, so let's talk about some of the new things that poems can have that we're going to learn about in the poems we'll read this week. So not only will poems have lines and rhythm and interesting words, and sometimes they rhyme, they can also have repetition. And repetition means that sometimes it'll have words that repeat over and over again. And some of these poems are also going to use alliteration. That's what that word is, alliteration. Alliteration means that they like to use the same sound over and over again, like the same letter sound. And then also we need to know that poems don't always rhyme. They don't have to rhyme. Usually they do, but they do not have to. And when they don't rhyme, that's called free verse. And we're going to look at some examples of repetition and alliteration and free verse right now. So let's look at a poem that has some repetition, and we're going to see if we can find the repetition. This poem is called Splish, Splash, Splosh, and it's by James Carter. And he's going to read Splish, Splash, Splosh to us. And while he reads it, look for repetition. Look for words that are being repeated, okay?
Splish, splash, splosh. Babies in the bath do it. Puddles on the path do it. Grannies for a laugh do it. Splish, splash, splosh. Dirty welly boots do it. Dainty little shoes do it. Drippy doggies too do it. Splish, splash, splosh. Waterfalls and waves do it. Giant killer whales do it. Little fishes' tails do it. Splish, splash, splosh. Buses rushing past do it. Rivers flowing fast do it. Raindrops fall at last do it. Splish, splash, splosh. Swimmers in the pool do it. Penguins in the zoo do it. Dolphins in the blue do it. Splish, splash, splosh. In the summer sun do it. Do it as it's fun do it. Come on everyone do it. Splish, splash, splosh.
All right, I liked Splish, Splash, Splosh. I bet you noticed that it is written in lines, just like poems are supposed to be. It definitely has rhyming words because it always ends with it, and of course that rhymes. And he used some interesting words like dainty, dainty little shoes. I bet you've never heard of dainty. Dainty just means something that's really small. So yeah, dainty little shoes. But he also used repetition. Did you notice what he kept repeating over and over again? Yeah, splish, splash, splosh. He repeated that through the whole poem. He also repeated the words do it in almost every line, didn't he? Yeah. So he used a lot of repetition. A lot of times poets will use repetition just to kind of make their poem more interesting, to have a better rhythm. Sometimes that's the most important thing with the repeating too. Since he's talking about it seems like he's talking about splashing in puddles, doesn't he? Or splashing in anything, I guess. And that's kind of the most important thing, the splish, splash, splosh. So that's why he repeats it. All right, the next new thing that we're learning about poems is alliteration. And remember, alliteration is when a poet decides to use the same letter sound like over and over again. So let's look at an example of that. This poem is called Over My Toes, and it's by Michael Rosen. And he's going to read it to us. And while we are reading Over My Toes, look for some alliteration. Look for what sound that you hear over and over again in this poem.
Over my toes. Over my toes goes the soft sea wash. See the sea wash. The soft sand slip, see the sea slip. The soft sand slide, see the sea slide. The soft sand slap, see the sea slap. The soft sand wash over my toes.
Oh, that one had a really good rhythm too. It did kind of sound like a song. The soft sea wash, see the sea wash. Yeah, I like that rhythm. But did you notice the alliteration in this poem? Did you notice a letter that kept being repeated over and over again? I did. It was, what sound did you hear over and over again? Yeah, the S sound, didn't you? Over my toes goes the soft sea wash. See the sea wash. The soft sand slip. Yeah, he has a lot of S's in this poem, and that's alliteration. A lot of times a poet would use alliteration just to make their poem more interesting and have a better rhythm, just like that they do for repetition. So good. Sometimes poets will use alliteration. And the last thing that we need to know about poems are that they can be written in free verse. And free verse just means that they don't rhyme. And actually, almost all the poems that we're going to read in our books this week are going to be free verse, which means they will not rhyme. They're not going to have any rhyming words. Let's look at an example of one that has free verse. All right, this one is called Night Flight, and it's by Laura Mucha, and she's going to read it to us. And notice when you read Night Flight that it will not rhyme. It's not going to be a rhyming poem. It'll be free verse. But it still does have rhythm, it uses interesting words, and it's written in lines. Let's listen to Night Flight.
Night Flight. Tonight I fancy a flight, so I shuffle my short feathers and jump. Clusters of city lights stretch, spread and sprawl into sparkling starfish. A whisper of clouds tickles my feet. A current lifts me like a leaf. I float, I glide, I hold my feathered wings out wide and watch the world beneath. The occasional plane passes, the odd meteorite. Together we set the sky alight. Flight is always best at night.
I liked that poem. They even put some music when they read that poem, didn't they? So it really was like a song. It had a really good rhythm. I also noticed that it did not rhyme. Tonight I fancy a flight, so I shuffle my short feathers and jump. Flight and feathers and jump. None of those words rhyme, do they? Clusters of city lights stretch, spread, and sprawl into sparkling starfish. None of those words rhyme. So this is a free verse poem. It doesn't rhyme. But it still is written in lines. It has a rhythm. And she also uses those interesting words like sprawl and sparkling. Those are kind of interesting, better words than using just normal words. So that was a great example of free verse. All right, did you enjoy learning about those new things that poems can have? I did. There's one other thing that we need to talk about before I read you some of the poems in our story. Every poem that we look at is going to be also about things that can be exciting in nature. And every poem that we just listened to also could be talking about things that might excite us about nature. The first poem was called Frost. And it talked about how we wake up in the morning and we look out the window and we see the first frost and how that can be kind of exciting to see everything covered in white and how that is kind of interesting and fun. Oh, the second poem was about the splish, splash, splosh and how it's kind of exciting to go splashing in puddles and playing. Those things can be exciting about nature when it rains and you go play in the puddles. And then the last poem, Night Flight, she's kind of imagining she's a bird because it says feathers, so I know it must be talking about a bird. Sorry. Okay, sorry. She's talking about a bird and how that would be exciting to kind of fly around at night and look down and see all the lights and everything, wouldn't it? So that would be exciting, something in nature. So when I read these new poems to you in just a minute when we get into our vocabulary lesson, I'm going to read the poems to you. And see if you can find some things that might excite us in nature, okay? All right. I hope you enjoy the poems this week. See you in a few minutes.